Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on such a gorgeous, beautiful evening to hear me speak. As Esther was saying, me and my family, we're members here, so I feel like I'm coming home to talk to this wonderful JCC community. What I want to do is spend about 10, 15 minutes talking about the journey that took me to writing this book. And then I'm going to read a couple of really short excerpts just to give you a sense of my style and how I write about PTSD. And then I want to open it up for Q&A. You know, my book was released last month, and I've been talking in a lot of different venues all over the country. And the Q&A is what I have found to be really meaningful. I feel like people have a lot of curiosity about trauma. I think people have a lot of great questions. And in engaging in the Q&A, it reminds me why I felt like this book needed to be written in the first place. So I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A, and I just welcome your questions. So I'll start with my journey to writing this book. It began in 2007 on a road trip that I took with my dad. At that time in 2007, I was a psychiatrist in private practice, very well settled in the Midwest, really nice, comfortable life. And my dad and mom were visiting from England. That's where they lived. They live to this day. That was where I was born and raised. And they were visiting from England, and that year my dad turned 70. So we took a road trip to celebrate his birthday. We went to Florida and up to Washington, and then we landed in New York. And one morning, early in the morning, we were leaving New York, headed back home to the Midwest, and we left really early in the morning to beat the traffic. And my dad started telling me this story. He spoke of his childhood in India. He spoke of his parents and his siblings, people who I had never really known. And he spoke of what happened to his family in 1947. Now, what he told me wasn't new. I knew what had happened, the nuts and bolts of that story. In 1947, the British were getting ready to leave India after centuries of colonial rule. And before they left, they partitioned the country into two: the Republic of India with a Hindu majority, and then Pakistan with a Muslim majority. Unfortunately, the plan was very negligently orchestrated, very haphazardly executed. It was kind of rushed. They were in a hurry to quit India. And the result was a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos. People on the ground didn't know what was going on. There was horrific intercommunal violence. Millions and millions were killed. Many, many millions were forced to flee. Something like 75,000 women were raped and mutilated. So this was a really huge event in the history of South Asia. And I had always known that my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, had been murdered in partition. And as a result of his murder, my dad, who was 10 at the time, was orphaned. So, like I said, the story my dad was telling me wasn't new. I'd heard the nuts and bolts of it. And even though I was raised in England, 20 years later, my dad, now an adult, would move to England, and that's where I was born and raised. Even though I was raised in a country thousands and thousands of miles away, even though partition had happened decades before I was born, I had very little link to India, barely been to India. No heirlooms, no photographs of grandparents. But I always felt the presence of partition. And I say felt because I think as a child, all you ever have is a feeling, an awareness. You don't really have the words for it. But I always had this feeling of that harrowing social descent that my dad experienced in 1947 as a 10-year-old boy who was orphaned, living as a refugee, forced to be a child laborer. That descent was palpable in my childhood. So he's telling this story, and which I've said before was not unfamiliar, but the way he was telling it on the road trip was really different to the way I remember hearing about it as a child. And the reason I bring that up is this is a very important point about trauma survivors and the way they narrate their story. When I was a child, whenever he would talk about partition, it was often these little bits of information that he would drop in at really inopportune times, often accompanied by his bitterness, his anger, his frustration. they came to represent these awkward intrusions. I really didn't know what to make of them. And his story was kind of very chaotic, and it was fragmented, it was all over the place. In short, his story was a little hard to hear when I was growing up. But on the road trip, it was different. By this time, it was 2007, he was 70, he was retired. He'd been going back to India more in his retired life. He'd been able to talk to extended family members. He'd been able to get information about, missing bits of information that he'd wanted to collect. So when he was telling me the story now, it was different. It was smooth. It was cohesive. No anger, no bitterness. It was stripped of that. And as he was talking, I was sitting in the car listening to him talk, and it dawned on me, I realized what his story was. By this moment in time, my dad was the sole surviving member of his family of origin. And what he was offering me was testimony. And I recognized testimony because as a doctor, patients give you testimony all the time. They tell you their deepest, darkest secrets. They tell you their worst fears, things they may never have even told their loved ones. But they share it. And there's something about testimony that is very intentional. This is not a casual narration. It's very intentional. The person who's telling you the testimony wants to leave something in the person who's hearing it. So that struck me. Anyway, the road trip was over. My parents went back to England. I went back to my life in the Midwest as a psychiatrist. But I couldn't let go of that road trip. I could not let go of that testimony. So I buried myself in the history of South Asia. I really didn't know very much about the partition. I knew very little about colonial history. I wanted to know more about the world that my grandparents lived in. I also wanted to know more about my grandparents, who I had never met. They'd both died decades before I was born. And they'd occupied these very anonymous recesses in my childhood growing up. But now I wanted to know everything about them. So I got to know them the only way I know how as a psychiatrist. I asked my dad a bunch of questions, everything he could remember, where they were born, what languages they spoke, what kind of household they were raised in, how educated were they, what were their likes, dislikes, their passions, their positive traits, their negative traits. And I kind of recreated this kind of psychological profile of my grandparents, because that was all I had, in essence. And then in parallel, of course, I was still a psychiatrist in private practice. I was still taking care of patients. But now I was really listening to trauma stories in a way that I'd never done before. And obviously, as I was a psychiatrist, I knew something about PTSD. But now I was really, really paying attention, and I just felt this urge to know more about PTSD. Because what was becoming really clear to me is that all along, I had been from these very traumatized people. But I hadn't really known that. Cognitively, I hadn't made those connections until just after that road trip. So then I started thinking, well, what am I going to do about it? And by this point, obviously I was a very educated person. I had a platform, I had a voice. And it occurred to me, well, maybe it would make sense for me to devote the rest of my career to helping people survive in the aftermath of surviving the unspeakable. That seemed to make sense. But for me to be able to do that, I had to make some tough decisions. The biggest one being I had to go back to being a trainee after being in private practice, which meant becoming a fellow and requiring a move to California, which I'm glad of now, 12 years on, but that was not an easy move. So we moved to the National Center of PTSD. That's where I trained to be a PTSD specialist, and I learned how to be a trauma scientist. For 2.5 years, I was a postdoctoral scholar at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And now, 2019, so it's 12 years on, I think it's fair to say I'm pretty schooled in PTSD and traumatic stress. Currently, I serve as the medical director for integrated care at our VA here right in Palo Alto. So my clinical practice, I'm involved in taking care of veterans. I'm still a trauma scientist at the National Center for PTSD. I do health services research, and I'm also on faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford. So it's from this position, this kind of personal family connection, as well as my credentials, that I write this book, The Unspeakable Mind. And really what I wanted to do was write a book for the general reader, a book that tells the full story of PTSD, the complete story of PTSD, from the cellular to the biological, from the psychological to the emotional, from the cultural to the global, the complete story. And I do this really in three main ways. A lot of it is stories from 20 years of being a doctor, and sharing those stories to show the different facets of PTSD. I was fortunate enough to interview some of the top scientists in the field and have interspersed their snippets of those interviews throughout the book. And then also I wanted to deconstruct a massive body of science. In essence, since 9/11, since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, since major natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, there has been a surge in knowledge about what we know about PTSD, the science of PTSD. And this is a body of evidence that continues to grow exponentially. And I'm fortunate to have a window into this body of science, but I really feel that this knowledge has not filtered down. People are not aware of how much we know about PTSD. So deconstructing that body of science was a big mission behind writing this book. And ultimately, I want to offer hope. You know, the rapid advances in the treatment of PTSD that have occurred literally in the last 20 years means that this condition, which was once considered incurable, disabling, is today very treatable, very manageable. So ultimately, my message is one of hope. So I want to share a couple excerpts from the book. The first thing I'll do is read the introduction, because I think that just gives a really good kind of lay of the land and the main thrust of the argument that I'm trying to make about PTSD. That in essence, you know, when we think about PTSD, we tend to think of the soldier coming back from war. But the reality is PTSD goes way beyond that. You know, there are many traumas that can cause PTSD, and it really is an inextricable part of all of our lives. So I'll share the introduction, and then I'm going to share a little story about a veteran that I was taking care of who had PTSD, which was manifesting in a very physical way, literally making him sick. His body sick, his heart was sick. And I want to share a snippet of that story because I think that's not something that is widely known, that PTSD extends beyond this notion of mind or brain. You know, it makes our cells sick, it makes our bodies sick, it interferes with organs and the way our systems work, and so it literally contributes to physical disease as well. So I'll share those two, and then we can move to Q&A. So this is the introduction. Imagine, if you will, a circle. Entering this circle is every American who survived a trauma. By trauma, I don't mean a messy breakup, losing a job, or having a home repossessed, even though these are all thoroughly stressful. Traumatic events go beyond that, to a moment when your life is threatened, you are rendered helpless, and your sense of normalcy is shattered. Perhaps the most obvious image that comes to mind is the soldier back from war. But that is only part of the story. Being raped, robbed at gunpoint, surviving a fatal car accident, escaping a deadly fire, or witnessing a spouse, child, or parent be brutally assaulted can also be traumas. More than half of Americans will say that at some point in their life they have lived through such an event. And large numbers of them will report experiencing many such traumas. Indeed, exposure to danger appears essential to being human. Tragic stories of deadly floods, fires, hurricanes, and earthquakes fill the pages of history books with alarming regularity, and the horrors that result from human-made disasters, such as war, terror, and torture, provide bountiful evidence of humans' seemingly endless capacity to be inhumane toward one another. For the people in this circle, once the danger has ebbed, distress is natural. They may feel on edge, have nightmares, and be overwhelmed by traumatic memories. They may feel like this for hours, days, or weeks. But humans, by design, are psychologically resilient. The clear majority will heal with the passage of time. Now imagine within this circle a second, smaller circle of those who don't heal. At any given moment, a snapshot of this second circle would capture more than 6 million people. Despite no longer being in danger, they are unable to transcend their traumatic past. Instead, they suffer every day with invisible wounds. Some fall into oblivion, others seek revenge. This book is about the inhabitants of this second smaller circle. These people have PTSD. Post-traumatic stress is a constellation of symptoms that have been described since ancient times, yet the condition remains elusive. Humans are hardwired to deny the unpalatable, and this denial has taken a toll on our understanding of the impact of trauma on the human psyche. PTSD was not formally recognized by the psychiatric establishment until 1980, and no doubt this delay came at a large price. Traumatic stress cuts to the heart of life, interfering with one's capacity to love, create, work. Incapacity brought on not by poor lifestyle choices, moral weakness, or character flaws, but by a complex interplay among biology, genes, and environment. PTSD is a disorder of memory, famous for causing nightmares, flashbacks, and an exaggerated startle reaction. Lesser known, but equally devastating, is how it renders a person's emotional life barren. It mutes happiness and yields instead to an irritability that keeps sufferers on the perpetual verge of withdrawal from the world and alienation from those who love them. 80% of PTSD sufferers have at least one other psychiatric condition, typically depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, or anxiety, and all have a higher risk of death by suicide. PTSD seeps beyond the confines of the mind or brain. It impacts cells, organs, and bodily systems, and has emerged as a risk factor for various diseases, from cancer to heart disease to obesity. PTSD is so widespread that it can impact any of us, but the socially disadvantaged are the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, only a third of PTSD sufferers receive treatment because it's tough to diagnose and a challenge to treat, a situation further complicated by the fact that sufferers are often hard to reach. Traumatic stress can spread to anyone with whom the sufferer shares their lives. Trauma begets trauma. Most commonly affected are the sufferer's family members, who are at higher risk of developing depression, anxiety, and PTSD themselves. In cases of mass traumatization, such as torture, slavery, and genocide, we now know that PTSD's deep footprint can last for generations. The statistics speak for themselves. Most of us will, sooner or later, experience a potentially traumatic event. If you are fortunate enough not to have such an experience, the odds are that a loved one or others with whom your life is inextricably intertwined, in the community where you live, at the place where you work, where your children go to school or play, will be affected. None of us can afford to ignore PTSD. A soldier's heart, PTSD and cardiac disease. One crisp fall evening, my patient Richard asked his wife to drive him to the emergency room of his local VA hospital because he was having palpitations and felt pressure in his chest. Richard was in his 60s, a smoker with high blood pressure, so, as one might expect, the ER staff went straight to work, ordering EKGs, chest x-rays, stat blood tests, and an urgent cardiology consult. Richard's EKG showed atrial fibrillation. Instead of a smooth, steady beat, his cardiac rhythm was erratic, and his heart muscle was pumping inefficiently. He was at risk of having a stroke, or his heart failing altogether. The ER staff started him on a medication to slow his heart and he was soon feeling better. Buried in the documentation of his pulse rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, and various tests was a note by the ER attending physician that Richard appeared highly anxious. I had met Richard for the first time a few weeks before. Tall, with a slim build, save for some extra pounds he carried around his midriff, he was dressed in beige khakis and a blue t-shirt. His face was round and pale, and his eyes, framed by designer eyeglasses, were roomy. After settling into his chair, he drummed his fingers on the wooden arm. He was able to admit that he felt entirely out of his comfort zone. "I'm not really sure I need to be here," he said with a nervous laugh. When I asked him to elaborate, he told me that the previous year had been the worst of my life. He was experiencing bankruptcy after his small business had failed. His wife had recently lost her job, which not only had worsened their financial predicament, but was causing conflict in their 30-year marriage. Unemployed for the first time in his life, Richard found himself lost in the memories of Vietnam. More than 3 decades earlier, after his discharge from the military, he had thrown himself into a career as an entrepreneur, creating profitable businesses from inspirational ideas. He'd spent his life since Vietnam so busy that he had managed to avoid thinking about the war. He admitted to having spent his life in the office, micromanaging every tiny detail and garnering a reputation in the local community for his angry tirades and tough negotiation tactics. He also admitted, with sheepish bravado, that there had been years when he had drunk way too much scotch, chain-smoked cigarettes, and avoided sleep by guzzling strong black coffee. His life had ground to a halt with the death of his business. As if the flood of Vietnam War memories was not enough, he was waking up every night in a cold sweat, his sleep ravaged by nightmares. His sex drive had plummeted, and he was finding it hard to concentrate. He felt as though his body was sucked of energy. He was irritable and felt jumpy for no reason. He'd ended up in the ER on more than one occasion, thinking he was having a heart attack, only to be told that it was just anxiety, and discharged home. His worsening finances had forced him to transfer his healthcare from his private doctor to a VA internist. When she had heard about the ER visits, she'd immediately referred him to a psychologist. The psychologist had diagnosed Richard as having PTSD and recommended group therapy. But Richard found himself overwhelmed with anxiety when others shared their stories. "I'm used to being the leader, telling people what to do," he said, "not having to listen so much or be told what to do." His therapist had referred Richard to my clinic for a medication evaluation, and I agreed that his symptoms were severe enough that medication was warranted. Thankfully, Richard needed only a short hospital stay after that fall visit to the ER to settle his heart back into a regular rhythm. His hospital team did more tests to try and figure out why his heart suddenly went into atrial fibrillation, but could find no obvious culprit other than his severe anxiety. Many months later, after Richard's PTSD was stabilized with the use of the medication paroxetine and the sleeping pill trazodone, he revealed to me that on that fall day, he had experienced, for the first time in his life, a full-blown flashback of his combat experiences in Vietnam. For hours afterward, he had felt petrified, and that was when the palpitations had started. The truly chilling thing is that Richard's untreated PTSD may have literally flipped his heart into chaos. And that's all I have for you.
So at this time, we are going to open the floor to a 30-minute Q&A session. We ask that you share your questions directly as opposed to stories. She will be available after the event for more personal questions during the book signing.
Thank you so much. I just wondered if you could elucidate on rapid eye movement therapy for PTSD and what some of the techniques that Stanford's using that are kind of cutting edge or new different techniques that we haven't heard of.
EMDR, yeah. So that is a really tried and tried therapy that works very well for PTSD. It's one of the trauma-focused psychotherapies that works well. There's many others too. Prolonged exposure is one. Cognitive processing therapy is another one. And that's an example of some of the advances that I'm talking about that have literally come about in the last 20 years or so, where we have these really effective psychological talk therapies that can help people recover from trauma. So there's very good evidence for EMDR. It's kind of like my top of the list. It's like the gold standard, one of the things that you want to go to. You want to make sure everyone who has PTSD has access to that. So, luckily in the Bay Area, there are many people who provide that type of treatment. In terms of cutting edge, there's so much, there's like a whole chapter in the book on cutting edge. Let me think, in terms of talk treatments, for some people, the notion of revisiting the trauma is really daunting. EMDR, prolonged exposure, CPT, they require you to rework the trauma with the benefit of having a skilled therapist. But that's kind of integral to how those treatments work. I think a kind of nice thing that has developed in the last 5-10 years is non-trauma focused talk therapies, things like STARE, things like ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, which don't really require you to talk about the trauma per se, and what they focus on instead is the day-to-day consequences of living with PTSD. So, for example, a lot of people with PTSD will say, my temper goes from 0 to 100 in a second, like I have no control over my temper or my reactivity, or, my personal relationships are a mess. So in those therapies, the therapist will focus more on just the day-to-day and help teach the person coping strategies, tips, ways to negotiate life, living with the trauma without really going after the trauma. So those are some of the developments that I think that we have treatments that are that can be useful to a lot of people.
I have two questions. The first one is about complex PTSD, where it's not so trauma focused as it is environmentally focused on a chronic situation rather than an acute situation. So I'd like to know what you think are the best treatments for that. And the second one pertains to the Holocaust. As Jews, many of us are Jews. I'm the daughter of a refugee from the Holocaust. What is the biological effect, I guess, of being the daughter or child of a trauma survivor?
Okay, great. Maybe I'll start with that. Okay. So, it used to be back 20 years ago when I was first starting out in the field, we used to think the children of trauma survivors were going to be impacted just because of the environment that they were raised in, right? So, if you're raised by someone who has PTSD, that is going to impact the way you see the world, the way you navigate the world, because essentially someone is not well. You're being raised by someone who's not well. And so this, they used to use the word like psychological damage. I mean, that's a bit tough, but that kind of damage would impact kids, and they were much more likely to have depression or anxiety or PTSD themselves as a result. So, and that still exists, of course. Your environment has such a huge impact on your mental health. But basically in the last, I would say 10 years, there's been this evolution in our understanding of the field called epigenetics, which is really fascinating. It's still early days. I don't think we have a full sense of what is going on. But with epigenetics is this notion that if you take a man who was traumatized, you take a woman who was traumatized, it has an impact on the man's sperm, it has an impact on the woman's eggs. So when they go on to have children of their own, their children can inherit these changes through this process called intergenerational transmission. So literally, these children are carrying these changes in their blood. I call it carrying sorrows in your blood. So even though these children themselves may never experience a trauma, if in the course of their life they do, which, as I said in the introduction, is a very common event, so they probably will, they are going to respond with that history. Their bodies are going to respond from that position. So when you think about intergenerational transmission, when you think about epigenetics, you get a feel for the deep footprint that mass traumatization leaves and how it can literally pass through the generations. So it's a really exciting field. Like I said, it's very hard to study because, how do you separate out your social environment from epigenetics? But they're starting to find markers. They're following like salivary cortisol. They're starting to find ways to tease out the effects of epigenetics from social and environmental factors. And then your first question about complex PTSD, a lot of people have written to me asking about complex PTSD, which I think is an amazing niche diagnosis put forward by Judith Herman, the Harvard psychiatrist and a pioneer in the field of PTSD. In essence, complex PTSD, it's a much more practical diagnosis, because I'll tell you this, it's very rare for me to meet somebody who had a perfectly normal life, and then they experienced a trauma, and then they, had this life after the trauma, right? I don't meet people like that. I meet people who have had a lot of trauma throughout their life to varying degrees. I might be meeting them at this stage of the journey, after the straw that broke the camel's back. But the reality is a lot of people have had a lot of trauma throughout their whole life, whether it be childhood abuse or maybe rape at some point or surviving a serious car accident at another point. So in situations of child abuse or intimate partner violence where someone's in a chronically traumatizing situation, oftentimes they'll develop something known as complex PTSD, where they don't really have the textbook symptoms necessarily of PTSD. They might not have the nightmares or the flashbacks that we associate with PTSD. Instead, a lot of times people have been forced to adapt their personality so that they can survive under these terrible conditions. And what you see oftentimes is people with complex PTSD, they have a lot of problems in interpersonal relationships, in trust, They have a lot of problems regulating their emotions, because they literally have to go from like stuffing their emotions to, proclaiming out loud what is happening to them. So emotional regulation is an issue. Sometimes self-harm can be an issue. So complex PTSD, it's not really accepted as a diagnosis officially, but it's kind of like a niche diagnosis. It's really valuable for clinicians like me, because a lot of times that's what you're seeing. Treatments such as STAIR, STAIR, which was developed by my colleague Marilyn Cloyter, who's just an amazing trauma scientist and clinician, is really helpful for people who have complex PTSD. There's some pretty good data to support that, as well as all the other types of therapies as well.
I did. It was about complex PTSD. I have a different one. So I was curious about some of the new, I guess, information that's come out about drugs that are helpful in treating PTSD, and some of the data about benzos and how they may not be as helpful. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
So when we use medications to treat PTSD, in my mind, it's kind of a second-tier option. Really, if you look at the data, like I was saying before, the talk therapies is what works really well. So, if I loved someone who had PTSD, the talk therapy is what I'd want them to get first. But obviously, in real life, that's not often available, or it's not an option, or someone's tried them and it doesn't work. So then we think about medications. You're right, benzodiazepines is probably the one class of medications that is now contraindicated in the treatment of PTSD. In the long run, it just makes things worse. And benzodiazepines includes medications like Valium and Xanax and Ativan and Klonopin. We just know now that it's like a temporary Band-Aid, but it's a bad Band-Aid, and it just perpetuates the anxiety associated with the trauma. So we really try and stay away from those. And I barely prescribe them anymore. If I do, it's literally like 5 pills, break in case of emergency that someone has with them in case they're having just a really, really distressing experience. In terms of other medications that work for PTSD, SSRIs, SNRIs, commonly known as antidepressants, but they're not just antidepressants, they can work for a lot of things. They're very useful for PTSD. 2 of them, sertraline and paroxetine, have an FDA indication for PTSD. So they can help alleviate a lot of the symptoms, especially the physiological arousal that a lot of people have, that kind of hyperstartle reaction that a lot of people with PTSD have. It can really help with that. And then there's a lot of meds that we don't know yet. The jury's kind of out. Maybe they help, maybe they don't. We don't really have the data to know for sure. So things like prazosin for nightmares, the jury's out on that. Mood stabilizers, second-generation antipsychotics, like we don't know whether or not they work for sure. The data goes both ways. But so that's the kind of snapshot.
Well, there's also some new studies out of Hopkins and UCLA and UCSF for psilocybin, I think.
Yeah, so my understanding of those and then things like MDMA and all that, it's still early, it's still what I would put under the pilot kind of experimental. So, until we get those multi-site randomized controlled trials, until it's rolled out and we get to see all the side effects come through, it's not going to be a go-to, right? You want to use what's tried and tested first. Hi. Do you want to use the mic? Then everyone can hear it.
Yeah, would you share a little of the science behind the effectiveness of the video games and at the very early stages of the PTSD? You spoke about on the NPR piece where if the PTSD hadn't set in,
Yeah.
somehow you can, catch it. So.
Right. So there's this period of time known as the golden hours. And that is the period of time between exposure to trauma and the PTSD setting in. There's this period of time where clinicians and scientists feel there's an opportunity to intervene with medical intervention that can set the brain back on a pathway to recovery. And so there was a study done out of Oxford University, and it was just a study, so it's still experimental. But in essence, here's what happens when you develop PTSD. You go through a traumatic experience. Well, first of all, let me backtrack. For any memory to stay as a memory, your brain has to settle the memory, right? It has to be preserved via a process of consolidation. That's how you can remember what you had for breakfast this morning or where you went last night. The problem is with traumatic memories, the brain goes into overdrive. So you over-consolidate that memory. And that's why traumatic memories often have this intrusive, vivid quality, even though something might have happened 10, 15 years ago, but it can kind of still catch you out of the blue and it feels like it's happening in real time. So the scientists, their hypothesis was that, well, if we can interfere with that over-consolidation after trauma, those memories won't have that power. So then what they did is in the ER, when people were coming in and they'd survived a major car accident or they'd been physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, they had some people play the video game Tetris, which, if you have kids, video games are really kind of absorbing and they kind of suck you in and you're visually kind of just engaged in that. And they hoped that by distracting people, they could interfere with that over-consolidation. And they compared those people to other people who came in after being, surviving a trauma, who were just asked to, keep a journal or something, or just write down what happened. And lo and behold, when they compared the two groups, it felt like the Tetris playing group, the computer game playing group, they seemed to have less symptoms of PTSD when they were followed like 3 months, 6 months out. So that's the theory behind it. It was just one small study. So we don't know. We don't know if it could work a long time, but it's really intriguing, right? I mean, imagine that, something as simple as that could prevent the onset of PTSD, but we have to watch that space, yeah. We don't know if that will pan out. Hi.
Can you explain what STAIR is? STAIR?
Yeah, it's a therapy that you do with a therapist, either in group or individual. Skills, training, and interpersonal regulation. I'm pretty sure that's what the acronym stands for. I write about it in the book. And if you Google it, there's websites about it too. And essentially, it's a treatment that has been shown in controlled trials to be effective for the symptoms of not only PTSD, but also complex PTSD. But what they do, what the therapist does is they don't focus on the trauma. It's not a matter of rehashing the trauma and revisiting the trauma. They focus more on what are the everyday consequences of you living with trauma. So, for example, if somebody is having a tough time at work because they're very, very irritable, the therapist will help teach them ways to regulate their emotions, maybe relaxation strategies, breathing skills, whatever it is needed to cope with the symptoms better. So that's in essence what it is, but it is very useful for people who have PTSD. We're using STAIR a lot in the VA.
Sorry, could you?
So just so that other people can hear your question, yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk about the connection between OCD and PTSD.
So PTSD rarely lives alone. It often comes hand in hand with many psychiatric issues, depression, anxiety. In my mind, I kind of see OCD as coming under the anxiety disorders, substance abuse for sure. So I don't know if that's just because of like commonality in wiring or genetics. I don't know what it is, but they come hand in hand. So, you know, you can expect to see it. In my mind, when I think of OCD and trauma, what comes to my mind is people who have survived pretty significant, maybe child abuse, and they've learned to be quite rigid or perfectionistic, or they need to kind of control their environment, and that maybe that would be how it would manifest with OCD-type symptoms, you know? So I can't think of anything specific, but every time I meet with someone with PTSD, we're always looking for other comorbidities because they're always there. And then you have to treat everything. Otherwise, you're not going to make a dent in the PTSD. From trauma, you mean? So you mean trauma triggering symptoms of OCD as opposed to PTSD? Sure, that could happen, for sure. You know, there's a real misunderstanding. There's a lot, you know, even though PTSD has become part and parcel of our modern vernacular, I do think there's a lot of misunderstanding and assumptions made about PTSD. And one of those assumptions is that people think that, oh, well, if you survived a trauma, well, then you have PTSD. Like that is, you know, trauma equals PTSD. That is not the case. Trauma can trigger many different mental illnesses in someone who is vulnerable to developing that condition. So if you're vulnerable to developing depression, something traumatic could trigger an episode of depression. If you're vulnerable to developing a mood disorder, something traumatic could trigger a manic episode. It doesn't have to be PTSD. So absolutely, trauma could trigger any type of mental health condition if you have that inherent vulnerability for it.
So I have a question.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Actually, two. What about first, like someone who is in a trauma and sort of erased the memory? Is it possible that it would, you know, return someday and he or she will remember that? Second, about Holocaust or combat or something like that. Two people were at the same place, same time. They shared the same, you know, happening, but one had the PTSD, the other one not.
Yeah.
Would you say that the one who had it maybe was, you know, prone to it, or there was something going on before that triggered it?
Right. So, so just to take your second question, so it turns out, and that's a great point, right? Like that can happen just from what I read in the introduction. People are exposed to trauma all the time, but why is it only that small percentage who develop PTSD? So it turns out a third of that is probably determined by genetics, right? It's probably determined by the way we are wired, the way our body mounts a response to stress, a third of it. And then I think there's other factors too. We know women are more likely to develop PTSD than men, 2 to 3 times more likely, so gender would make a difference. Socioeconomics makes a difference. You know, if you've had a rough upbringing, if you've not had many role models of people who know how to cope in the aftermath, you know, if you don't come from a resilient culture, you're probably going to respond in a different way to somebody who's had maybe a really good life with very good role models and, you know, learned healthy ways of coping with stress. So those are some of the things, but I think it's important to emphasize that genetics is a big part, more than we would have realized 20, 30 years ago. And then the first part of your question, sorry, it's escaped me. What was the first part again?
It was about a memory which was erased.
Yes, erased. Okay, see, I forgot it too. But yeah, but really good question, because it happens all the time, right? So this notion that someone is living and then they have a trauma and then they talk about it, that nice linear narration, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. Typically when I see that scenario is with severe childhood abuse, right? Because children who depend on primary caregivers for their survival, if they're being abused in some way by a primary caregiver or somebody who's meant to be a trusted adult, in a way, survival makes more sense that you just block off that trauma. I mean, if you want to call it forgetting or compartmentalizing it or whatever, repressing it, whatever term you want to use, it actually makes sense, right, to do that? Because what choice does a child have? A child has to survive. Physical survival is paramount. We're wired to survive. Human beings are. But then what will happen is, as that child grows, then they'll start getting memories. Or they'll start getting psychiatric symptoms. And then it'll start to become clear what happened. The memories will come to the forefront. So what was a coping strategy in childhood will fall apart in adulthood. And unfortunately, that type of PTSD, we call it dissociative type of PTSD, it can be worse. The prognosis is worse. It's tough.
And if it's not a child, but an adult?
Yeah, it can happen too in adults. I see it less in adults, but yeah, it can happen. People can literally dissociate at the time of trauma, where they literally leave themselves in a way. You know, some people fight when they face trauma, some people flee when they face trauma, some people freeze and they literally shut down. So at the time of the trauma, they dissociate, so they might not have a conscious awareness of that trauma, and then it comes out at a later date.
I was curious, how far back genetically can the coding in the sperm and egg go back in terms of transmitting intergenerationally trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we know the answer to that yet. There's some studies that were done, I think there was a Dutch famine, like in the 1800s, and they followed the negative consequences of that intergeneral transmission, you know, women carrying babies or the impact on the women's eggs. I think maybe 2-3 generations, I'm thinking off the top of my head. But in terms of trauma, I don't think we know more than that. Like the study that I talk about in the book was done by Rachel Yehuda, who's a neuroscientist out of Mount Sinai. She followed moms who were pregnant in 9/11 and escaped the World Trade Center. She followed those moms and then she followed their babies. So we're talking about one generation. For PTSD, I don't think we were doing that type of work. So this is what we're going to find out. In the next 10, 20 years, we'll know, but I don't know. I don't think the science is there yet.
Hi. My question is about combat PTSD, and I come from Israel. So there is a conversation about it, definitely. Now, my impression, and maybe I'm wrong, my impression is that here in the United States, combat PTSD, I mean, following combat PTSD is much more prevalent than in Israel. Do you have any statistics? Am I right? What are the possible causes?
Yeah. So you've touched on a bit of a controversy there. I don't know the Israeli statistics off the top of my head, but I don't think they're that different to American statistics, prevalence rates. America's probably a little on the higher end. Europe is pretty close to America. New Zealand is pretty close. And I think Israel is in that range. It's not as high as America, but it's in that range. But you touch on a controversy, because there is a big global controversy, because when the WHO did studies to look at PTSD prevalence rates across the world, and they went to low and middle income countries, what was shocking was that the PTSD rates were coming back really low in places like China and South America and Africa, and the PTSD rates were coming back close to zero. So there's a big controversy, like what's the point of having a diagnosis that doesn't have a worldwide applicability, right? We should see the same rates of PTSD in Israeli soldiers versus American, like, you know, pretty much, give or take. I think a lot of it has to do with cultural expressions. You know, I think different cultures express trauma in different ways. I think PTSD has a very certain way of presenting in America, but to me, that's not a bad thing. We just got to get better at recognizing different cultural syndromes. You know, PTSD is a very socially influenced condition. You know, when child sex abuse was absolute taboo, when no one wanted to recognize that it was an issue, like back in the 1900s, 1800s, kids did not express symptoms of being abused. Instead, they would just faint, or they would have weird limb pains. It would manifest physically. So a lot of trauma, it depends on if people are ready to hear the stories and how accepting the wider culture is. So I think there's different cultural expressions and different ways that societies have of helping people heal, which influences the way PTSD takes shape. But what I get a little nervous about is this argument that some cultures don't have PTSD. Like, that makes me a little nervous because I don't think that's true at all. I just think people have different ways of expressing it.
We have time for one more question.
Can I say? Okay. I wanted to. Is this on? Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about the ICU experience for both the patient and the family, and how hospitals are helping people cope with that type of trauma.
Yeah,
because it's pretty traumatic.
Yeah, so there's a lot of literature now about how being in the ICU, so you know, if you're deathly ill and you're in the ICU and you recover from your illness only to have PTSD because that experience was just so traumatizing. For families too, so the data that I've seen for families is like moms of newborns in NICUs, you know, they can develop a lot of PTSD symptoms, like every time they hear a bell ring, you know, after the baby's left the NICU, but just those bells that signal that the baby's not breathing, or they get very triggered, you know. So it's definitely a thing. I think what's good, what has really shifted in the last 10 years, and I think this is the way we need to move forward, and I talk about it in the book, we really need to change where we offer care for PTSD, right? The old-fashioned model of me being sat in my psychiatrist office, usually miles away from the regular hospital building, that has to change, and it is changing now. We're bringing the treatment to the ERs, to the ICUs, to where people need them, right? So there have been some studies done where they've offered trauma-focused interventions to, you know, the moms of NICU babies. There's some work done with using the human stress hormone cortisol in the pill form, hydrocortisone, for people who have been sick in the ICU, and that has helped reduce rates of PTSD. There's something about giving that hydrocortisone that really helps. So I think we're getting a bit more aware that this is a thing that happens after people experience, you know, these kind of medically life-threatening situations. So hopefully if we're more aware of it, we're better at detecting it. And if we're better at detecting it, we're better at making sure we can get someone to the patient who can help them. But really, that's the way to go. Like, for the last 10 years, I moved my practice and I sit in primary care, right? So I don't sit in a mental health clinic anymore. I sit in primary care. My office is next to my colleagues who are internists. Why do I sit in primary care? Because that's where patients show up. You know, by the time a primary care doc gives a patient a referral to a psychiatrist, we'll lose 50% of people right there, right? There's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of avoidance associated with PTSD. They don't want to come and see someone like me. So if I'm there and their regular doctor introduces me to them, and we make it kind of seamless and we can help them whilst they're in the doctor's office, that makes a big difference. And, you know, I tell people, I'm seeing the patients that I've always seen, but I'm meeting them 10, 15 years earlier. just by moving my practice. And that makes a big difference with prognosis. The same way we say early intervention for breast cancer, the same way we say early detection for heart disease, it's the same for mental illness, it's the same for PTSD. The quicker you diagnose this and get people help, the better their outcomes. So I think location really matters.
Dr. Jain, thank you so much for
Okay,
being
thank you.
here.
Thank you.